Take people's money, but there's one thing I don't do. I don't want to rip the book. I'll give you one, but I'll give you another way.
I'd like to welcome you to the new venue. 20 minutes for a vendor's report, and then we go straight into the AGM.
Okay, well, as you probably know, I've been around the hobby for a long time. Some years back I decided I needed some signals, couldn't get anybody interested in making them, the usual people. So I went in and did them myself. Originally they were through Shapeways, and they still are. In fact, the 7mm scale ones I have are actually on the Shapeways site, which there is a link to my Shapeways signal branch shop there. I have two examples over there. I have more in the range. Offhand, I've got left and right brackets. There's a distant 23 foot, there's a 27 foot one, and a 18 foot and a 16 foot and an offset one from memory. But also on the side I have, I think 54 different 7mm scale items, including things like fish plates that stick on the side of rails, and on the back of this, down the bottom corner, is a picture of a mechanism with a linear servo on it. I've got these for HO. I'm sure they probably work for O-scale as well.
I mean, some of you who are involved with the British O-Gauge Guild Forum, you'll see a lot of commentary about the situation with slaters, but they're not the only one. There's been a lot of the manufacturers over there, and postage out of or couriering stuff out of the UK is a nightmare. When Pico were shut down for a while, the distributors here have been pretty good though, but there's been times when there's been nothing. It just gets stripped out really quickly. So, I mean, I've got a pretty good stock of Pico components, but I mean, we still have things on the drawing board. I would still like to do the 12 class. I've already paid for the moulds and so forth for the locomotive part of it. We're still to decide on tenders, and that's when the wheels fell off with them, particularly with COVID, but with Stephen's situation. So, but look, I've still got a pretty good stock of stuff in the shop, so and I will get these kits back into stock as well.
I don't know if any of you have seen any of the photos I've published either on my blog. I think I'm going to put a couple on the blog. I don't do a lot of blogging these days because there's so many other outlets you can use. On the Facebook group, and I think I've even put a couple up on the Groups I.O. group of the diesels that I've been weathering. Now, just to give you a little bit of background, Peter Krause is a friend of mine. He used to own Aus, and he has a couple of Aus7 diesels, and of course they come pristine, and I like my diesels dirty. So while he actually asked me to install a couple of decoders following John's articles in 7th Heaven on putting them into a 49 and a 45, and I think the 48 was easier for him to do himself, so he didn't need me to do it. But the complete, reinstall or install of a decoder. So he actually asked me to do one, and he gave us some kits as payment sort of thing. And in that process, I decided to weather them at the same time. So that's a little bit of the background. So I actually had two 49s to do. Do I need to weather my locos? And personally, I think that's only a question you can answer yourself. I don't really believe that anybody can tell you whether or not you should. One, you'll then find that you probably one, it's probably likely. So that's probably the biggest consideration I would suggest, all right? But the chances are a collector in 20 years' time, and I don't know, I think I'll be around in 20 years' time, let alone the rest of us here, but in 20 years' time, if you are looking for a collector to buy your locomotive, the chances of finding one that's interested in a weathered locomotive is probably unlikely. They're far more likely to be interested in a pristine loco that hasn't been touched. So the answer to that one is yes. it will probably destroy the resale value. However, I didn't buy my locos as an investment. I bought them to run on my layout at the prototype and use that as a starting point. And those are 48, obviously, sitting in parks, actually. The things I've numbered these because they're just things I quickly want to, I suppose, emphasise as we have a look at the photo of the loco. It is a photo I took. Is number one, that marking along the bottom of the body. I like to put a loco like that back together again and never have to touch it again inside unless it needs maintenance. Okay? So that's what I would suggest. Don't wait for 20 years. Do it when you first got it, when you start to fiddle around with the internals. Now, aside from the weathering powders I use, which are mainly Cars and Bragdon, and it's sort of the commonly available colours, they're the ones I use. So that's just a little stand I made for something else, but it's just to demonstrate where I'm sitting. Now, I mask the windows off. If the windows don't actually just fall out on their own, most of them do.
Thank you for the Aus7 group for letting me come along and pontificate on something that I know not a lot about, but we'll see how we go. And I found the original magazine that I bought as a modeller. And would you believe that the middle article is converting old O-gauge models to a finer scale. I've made a lot of mistakes along the way, but I've also learnt a lot. So when you look here at the slides, you'll see that most of the stuff was done on the day I was learning a lot. So, in other words, I make a lot of mistakes. John Mackenzie, anyone that knows John Mackenzie was either loving or hating, or made life difficult to live with, but he knew that I was interested in O-gauge for a long time. And one day he said, "Hey Bob, there's a loco for you." And it was a 57 class O-gauge. It's the one on the top. It comes down to the question of should we retire, restore, or keep them running? That's our big...
Sometimes we have a topic sitting in front of us, and I know John has done talks at our forums before, so for me it was an easy ask, but to a very large extent, John's layouts, because there is more than the one, for me perfectly epitomise that I suppose that notion or that way of creating something that fits into a very small space, but seeing it in photos and maybe on a bit of film footage creates an impression of size that's well beyond what the actual dimensions of the layout are. I've been lucky enough to actually visit John's layout in his home, this one, the Impossible layout, or Murray Street. I've actually been lucky enough to visit it, but I mean a lot of you will have seen Valley Heights as well, and it's another one of those layouts that fits into a very small space. And I'd encourage you to look at this not just in terms of what John's done, but also what I might do or what you might do in a very small space. How you might begin building a layout. Look at the way he's used the small space and how he thinks through that process, because it is really it's really quite a valuable exercise. So
We go back about a decade ago, maybe it's slightly more than a decade. I started a series of articles which became known as Valley Heights. And if you can recall back, and some of you got great memories and will recall back, that in the very first of those articles, I warbled on a bit about trying to choose what layout to build. And at that time, there were two places I was considering. One was Darling Harbour, and the other one was Valley Heights. And at the time, I seem to remember that I said in that article something like Valley Heights seemed to be the obvious choice, because quite frankly, to make a small layout interpretation of Darling Harbour was impossible. Hence, the impossible layout. Well, time moved on, and I did make Valley Heights, and I also moved on to the impossible layout, the layout that became ultimately known as Murray Street, which I guess is its proper name now. The construction Construction is based on a 3mm girder. Now those two pieces there are simply sample pieces, they weren't actually used. And there are the three pieces of Murray Street, the three modules, because it was going to take 3 modules to put it together. And so I broke up what I think was a few rules here. This whole concept of having a rear, a back, and a plinth on the top, and it all made of 3mm MDF. I must confess, I was not at all sure it would be strong enough. But these are the buildings that I wanted to cover in model form. Now, because they were at the back, and because we're only talking about 500mm, so it's all, I'm compressing everything down. I only need to show the front of the building. And the other reason is I wanted to try and condense the scale very slightly. So these buildings were made very slightly smaller, about 7/8 of O scale. And they're done very simply. We're back to 3mm MDF, this time with some great assistance to do a great deal of laser cutting for me, which was a great asset. And then it's covered with a brick paper, which I printed, and the windows, which I obviously had to make, and you know I've made, because we've talked about these before, they're all made using a 3D printer. So that's one of the buildings. Lots and lots of windows. And this is another interesting thing about this particular hobby. I realised I was going to have to make lots of windows, about 650 altogether, and also a number of other parts. And quite frankly, this layout would not have occurred unless I'd bought a 3D printer. And I'll touch on that briefly in a moment. But that proved to be a tremendous benefit. These windows are not very special. They're not super high quality by any stretch of the imagination. But because they're in the background, they're fine. They're far enough away you can't see them. They are glazed in the final buildings. But they became possible because of the use of the 3D printer. And if we assemble all those elements together in simple form, so that's pretty much what the layout looks like.